Well, today on the show, we're talking about faith and when it fails. When Faith Fails is the name of the new book by Dominic Doan. He's senior pastor of Westside, a Jesus church in Portland, Oregon. Now, the celebrated novelist Dostoevsky once wrote, "My Hosanna is born out of a furnace of doubt." And as we approach faith and doubt on the show, we're going to be hearing both Dominic's story of how he himself has struggled with faith and doubt, even as the pastor of a big church in the States. And how he kind of put his faith together again after a significant period of questioning. That's really at the centre of this new book by Dominic, When Faith Fails, Finding God in the Shadow of Doubt. And in conversation with Dominic today is Andrew White. Andrew is back on the show. He's been on a few times over the years. He's going to talk about his journey of doubt. Unlike Dominic, his journey led him out of Christianity to, I suppose, agnosticism, though we'll let Andrew talk about that himself. Now he's a co-host of things like the Doubts Aloud podcast and has a number of other projects and things that he's involved in. So Dominic and Andrew, welcome along to the show today.
Thank you, Justin.
Thank you.
It's great to have you both in studio with me today. We'll come to you first, Dominic, because you've come the furthest for this. And I am delighted to say that I know where you've come from because I was there last year at Westside of Jesus Church in Portland, Oregon. We had a fantastic weekend that flew by all too quickly with a debate, unbelievable, the Conference USA, our first conference out in the USA, and I had the privilege of preaching as well on Sunday morning. So
people are still talking about that day.
Don't let him back. Is that what they're saying?
Exactly.
Yeah. No, it was an absolute pleasure to be with you. But at that time, the book was still kind of a work in process,
right.
And you were able to share some of the journey that led you to write it. But tell us a little bit now that it's here and available. When Faith Fails, where did it all come from?
Yeah, I think there was really multiple aspects to it. Part of it was my own faith journey, which I'm sure we'll unpack in our time together. But secondly, I think a byproduct of the cultural moment in which we find ourselves in, how it seems that more and more, and this is speaking from stateside, although I was born here in England.
Oh, you were actually born in Oxford.
I was born in Oxford.
Yeah.
You never guess it based on the accent. But there's something happening back in the States right now where doubt is on the rise. So some recent polls on that, recent Pew survey, number of Americans who say they experience doubts about God has actually increased 15% in the last 10 years. Church attendance is at an all-time low. That's another report that just came out 2 weeks ago. 2/3 of people that identify as Christians say that they struggle with doubt on a regular basis. And then, of course, Gen Z is now considered the least Christian generation in our nation's
history. It's the rise of the nuns, those who say they have no religion whatsoever.
Yeah, I think James K. Smith said that we don't believe instead of doubting, we believe while doubting.
Right.
We're all Thomas now. So there's something really fascinating that's happening just in our cultural landscape, how increasingly people are wanting to have conversations about doubt. And I think inside the church, there are some unhealthy responses to doubt. And I just wanted to initiate that conversation. I think one option that people are given inside the church when they experience doubt, and it could be doubts about the Bible, it could be doubts that come out of a time of suffering, it could be doubts because of hypocrisy or politics that they see in the church. I mean, fill in the blank. There's so many things that feed our doubts. But so often in the church, we're given two options. Neither one is good. Option one is to demonize our doubt. And I think this is especially prevalent in church culture, where we're not given space to share what it is that we're feeling and experiencing. Questions are suppressed.
I mean, I was going to say you're the pastor of a church, a pretty big church as well. And I can imagine some people think, well, hey, there's a guy up the front who knows what he believes and is teaching us all what we should believe. I guess he never has doubts. And people think, oh, I must be the odd one out here in this church where everyone looks like they're on fire for God. But that's not always the picture, is it?
No. I saw a TV interview a few years ago where they asked a well-known megachurch pastor back in the States. It may have been on CNN. And they asked him point blank, do you ever struggle with doubt? And his response, I mean, he looked absolutely mortified. Of course not. No.
Really?
Yeah. And this is the impression that's given, is that the further along you are in your spiritual walk, the less doubts you have. And I actually think the opposite is true.
Okay.
I think that as you increase in your understanding of who Jesus is and go further down the road of faith, doubt is going to feel more poignant, more painful, sharper.
Yes.
I think the deeper your faith, the deeper the level of doubts one can experience. I mean, John Wesley, he once said, the higher the hill, the stronger the wind.
Tell us about your own journey then, because you've sort of well, you weren't born into a Christian family, were you?
No.
But your parents did become Christians, and you became a Christian yourself at some point along the line as well. In that sense, do you feel like faith kind of came to you naturally when that did happen, or was doubt always there as part of the mix?
I think some people are kind of hardwired towards skepticism or doubt, and some Christians I know, that's not part of their story. It's like they've always believed. They came out of their mother's womb speaking in tongues, singing Hillsong, and I envy that. I think that's a beautiful thing. But I think for most of us, doubt is just part of the complicated, enigmatic mess of what it means to be human. That's why Jude 22 says, "Be merciful to those who doubt," because that is the story for so many of us. And in my story, the first half of my childhood, raised here in the UK up until the age of 8 in Southern California, born into a home that was really struggling in so many ways. My father was an alcoholic and drug user, and my parents were going through a season of divorce. My dad at one point was living in his car in San Diego, and my mom, a single mom, doing her best to raise my sister and I. And then at the age of 10, and I think you had a similar experience maybe, where you first heard the gospel, or you were brought to Jesus, Andrew, at a young age. But at the age of 10, I heard the gospel, responded to that, and there's a whole incredible story behind that where my dad, he was on this path where he had no interest in God or Bible, Jesus, Christianity. But every single night, my mom and my sister and I would get on our knees and we'd pray for him. And we did this for months, which was quite remarkable for my mom, just all that she went through. And yet she still had this heart and faith that Jesus could redeem and restore him. And one night he came over.
Wow.
And he said, "Look, I need to change. I've seen this change in you," speaking to my mom. And I need God in my life. And he sat on the back porch of our home. He opened his heart to Jesus, and he became a Christian. He moved back home at that point, and they literally tore up the divorce papers. All they had to do was sign them, and they tore them up, and they got back together, and it's incredible.
Yeah.
So I saw this massive shift.
Almost like a miracle.
It was a miracle. It went from a broken home to a home that was really all about Jesus from 10 on. But as can so often happen in those stories, I think the pendulum swung pretty far to legalism. Okay. And so I remember those first couple years and my parents coming out of that background of partying and my dad alcoholism to now, hey, we're all about Jesus. And so anything that wasn't Jesus was quote unquote the world and therefore bad. And so we went church hopping for a few years. And in that time, as a young lad, I'm trying to process what I had seen, what I had experienced with this God that I now believed in. That created a lot of doubt. But because of just the church context which we found ourselves in those initial years, I didn't know what to do with the doubts.
Okay.
And I think that is an unhealthy response where we suppress them, we push them out of mind. Another, I think, equally unhealthy response to doubt that we're seeing increasingly today is not so much demonizing our doubt, but it's to idolize them and to put more trust in the doubt than it is the thing we're doubting.
Well, I'm going to come back to how your story progressed in a moment's time as we open up the whole subject of doubt and faith. And we'll even get around, I imagine, to sort of giving some definitions to those words as well. But welcome back to the show, Andrew.
Thank you.
So you returned. What's interesting in a way about the fact you're back here, Andrew, is when I first had you on probably 10 years ago or more.
Almost.
You would still have called yourself, I think, a Christian at that point.
Yeah, but very much in the liberal.
Yes. You'd been on a significant journey.
It's a journey that some people almost
point.
say, oh, well, this is where this person's going. But I would definitely say liberal at that point. But I was Christian.
Obviously came a point at which things... You got to a point where actually you didn't feel there was enough there to hold on to and to claim being a Christian anymore. I mean, again, it'll have to be brief, but do you want to take us on that journey and where you find yourself?
Yeah, well, picking up from what you just said there, Dominic, I had, in one sense, a secular humanist background until 11 when my parents or my stepfather and mother became radical Christians, literally from a child's point of view, overnight. It seemed it was like from one world to another.
So quite similar, yeah.
Yeah. Suddenly in church and all the rest of it. It was quite something. So that's sort of their story. But to sort of move on quickly in being involved in church. And say Bible camps, we were in Bible camps in England. I remember somebody coming in and talking to me and saying, God has no grandchildren. You can't, meaning
you can't inherit your parents' faith.
Yes, you don't inherit your parents' faith. And he says, do you want to make a decision for Christ? And, the standard sort of thing, in a very British way. And so that's when I took it on board myself. And I really would say I had an experience of some sort that I would have believed was the standard sort of born-again experience at the time. And went on from there. But I would say that as a personality, I might be one of these ones wired for doubt. And so because I took things quite seriously compared with a lot of other people in my youth group, and I was the one that left at 18 to join YWAM to become a missionary,
right.
And so others were going to get this job and that job. And so, but the beginnings of my doubt, I would say, becomes, as we've mentioned before in previous shows, in the sudden realization that, oh my gosh, some of these YWAM teachings are so different from what I taught, and now I'm sort of confused about what is biblical in certain areas, whether it be Calvinism or women in ministry or evolution and science, these sort of things. And so they all started to have a play in my mind that goaded me on to find the truth, not to really doubt the faith, but just to find out what...
You had to press further in. To kind of... And of course, as you press further in, I'm sure you come into contact with even more kind of, ways of looking at things and things you hadn't even thought you could doubt it out, but...
I ended up at Bible College, Spurgeon's Bible College, and I didn't go to Bible College to become a minister as it used to be traditionally. It was literally... 1 day a week for 2 days a week for 4 years, and I wanted to get rid of what I thought was pseudo-Christianity, folk Christianity, as we talked about there, all the stuff that was sort of I don't know, I wanted to get more scholarly, more understanding, but I found that opened me up to more things that resonated with me more, which were the liberal books,
right.
And sometimes then going to the Bart Ehrmans and the more even more liberal, if you like, and they made more sense to me as a person in so many ways, and I'm sure you've touched into that kind of thing, Dominic, as I've read from your book, and so that sort of led me to roughly the position when I came to the show 10 years ago.
I mean, what was it like though when you realised, actually, I think I'm going to have to stop calling myself a Christian, and did that affect family, church?
Yeah, it was very, very, very hard actually, because I couldn't say it. I couldn't say the words. I can be at. I remember being at. I suppose my real doubts came towards the latter end of Bible college, but even then, I actually left and I led a Bible cell group in my church. And
even while you were experiencing,
even while I was experiencing these doubts, and I can remember,
yeah.
finishing that, and I was working with this other guy who was quite solidly evangelical, and we used to sort of talk about various issues in the group, and I would sort of bring all this other side of scholarship up that the other guy wouldn't, but he was aware of it. But we had these sort of, and the people were sort of watching us like table tennis, and I thought, hang on, I'm really these people are seriously wanting to know about stuff. And I was there, say 10, 15 years ago, and I thought, I can't do this anymore. I cannot do this because I'm doubting almost everything I'm saying, and they're lapping it up. Oh, this possible view, there's that possible view. And I'm thinking, I can't do this. So there came a point then, I think the final straw was when somebody came back. I mean, this is so fundamentalist. I seem to attract the fundamentalists in that group because someone came back and said, I've just been to a church and they're saying that Obama was the Antichrist. Andrew, what do you think about that? And I said, we've just done a whole session on preterism and how I think the book of Revelation refers mainly to the first century and not even to today. Why are you doing this? And they were like, what? And I thought, that's it. I can't do this. I can't do it at that level.
Right,
I can't engage with fundamentalism in this group. But soon after that, I still couldn't say. I don't even use the word atheist now. I use the word agnostic, and I fit in with secular humanism. But I say agnostic. Whereas my friend Ed and Francis on my podcast. A plug here, Doubts Aloud podcast that I do on iTunes.
You'll hear a few familiar voices from unbelievable shows on that.
Ed is absolutely fine on going straight with atheist and Francis. I tend to use agnostic for a whole set of other reasons. I think it's more to do with I was so certain and I was quite fundamentalist.
You're not going to replace it with another form
I
of
can't
certainty.
go.
Right,
Yeah, I'm much
sure.
more. I'm much more like, oh well, some people say. I always used to teach like that.
Yeah.
What do you think about this? Well, some people say 1, 2, 3, 4 different views.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the recap, really, of what's obviously been a journey of a couple of decades. We're going to be talking about doubt on the show today and exploring further into Andrew and Dominic's story. The book we're looking at specifically is When Faith Fails, Finding God in the Shadow of Doubt. It's by Dominic. It's available now and tells of his own struggles with doubt and how after a period of questioning everything, he began to put his faith back together again. We'll hear what happened with Andrew as well, and we'll be unpacking some of the questions we've begun to look at. You're listening to Unbelievable this Saturday afternoon. Don't forget you can get in touch as well via the email unbelievable@premier.org.uk or via our social media @UnbelievableJB for the Twitter account, facebook.com/UnbelievableJB for Facebook. All of the links and loads more available from the show page, including today's show and links to my guests. premierchristianradio.com/unbelievable. Today we're talking about When Faith Fails. Dominic Doane and Andrew White are joining me on the show today, and I've got to say, in some ways, I don't know if you feel this, Dominic, but when I hear a story like Andrew's, that's more of a challenge to my faith than like a hardened skeptic like Dawkins, who's never believed. Because at least with Dawkins you can say, oh well, he just hasn't experienced it, he doesn't know. But with Andrew I can't really say that, because I'm willing to grant that Andrew believed, that he was part of a Christian community. He had experiences he did believe genuinely were Christian ones, and now obviously outside of that. I mean, I think that is quite a hard challenge for many Christians, because that's a bit different, isn't it, to just sort of your hard-boiled skeptic, effectively.
Absolutely. I mean, when we lived back in England in 2010, I got to sit in a lecture with Richard Dawkins, and someone once asked him, they said, is there anything that would change your mind? Is there any evidence that we could present to you?
I sometimes ask that on this show.
And his response was no. He said, even if the clouds suddenly rearranged themselves and I saw Yahweh written in them, he said, I just write it off as some kind of psychotic moment. So there was literally nothing that would, so it's unfalsifiable in many ways. But what I hear in your story, and I think what does make it a more of a challenge, something to process and think through, is Andrew is hungry for the truth and is pursuing the truth. And his journey of doubt did take him down a time of seeking, searching, asking, openness to whatever God was going to show him. And he's come out through that saying, actually, I'm an agnostic.
Well, take us a bit further on in your journey then, Dominic, because I think as an adult, you continued to have certain doubts. In fact, you mentioned going to Oxford, and that was a time when you kind of were opening yourself up to really investigating, is this stuff true? It felt, when you describe it in the book, as a bit of a kind of a crunch point at which you were deciding, okay, I've got to sort out what I think about these things.
I think it's so healthy to come to those places in life where we actually bring it all on the table and say, okay, what do I really believe here? Am I just believing because my pastor taught me, or my parents taught me, or the cultural context in which I find myself in, or the church? We need to make our faith our own. I think of Jacob, who wrestled all night with God, and it was in that act of wrestling that his name was changed, and he became Israel, he who wrestles with God.
And got a lifelong injury as a result.
Yeah, and he did. And I think those seasons of wrestling and actually asking the hard question, we're not necessarily going to come away with all the answers. Chances are we'll walk away with a limp, but I think we would have been changed at a fundamental level. And so you're right. As an adult, I carried with me a lot of the doubts I had growing up, partially just the context in which I found myself in as a family, but also just the more I studied the Bible, parts of it were life-giving and beautiful, and then parts of it raised a lot of questions I didn't know how to respond to. Just normal things. Suffering is a big one. Just some of the things I saw at the age of 18 when I graduated high school. I went down to Mexico and lived for a year at an orphanage, volunteering there to help take care of disabled orphans with severe disabilities. And that was one of the first times in my life where I came just close with profound, I'd say almost gratuitous suffering, where these children were going through unbelievable things. Took care of a little boy named Ricky who had profound disabilities, cerebral palsy, couldn't feed himself, couldn't take care of himself. And so that year working with him, it changed me at a fundamental level, but it also exposed me to a level of suffering that I had not yet experienced.
And I get the impression from your book that I guess everyone has different kinds of doubts, and the ones that have most affected you have been that big question of suffering and evil.
Yeah.
Whereas perhaps with you, Andrew, it's been more the biblical kind of historical issues that have been the things that have driven a wedge in, if you like.
I like to say, for me, it's more of a cumulative case, and I like to describe it a bit like this room we're in. Not that those can see it right now, but it was a bit like one issue or loads of issues would be like the ceiling coming down, other issues this coming in, the floors coming up.
Indiana Jones style.
Yeah, that's right. Very much Indiana. I should think about that next time. That's great. And it was like a cumulative case. It was like, okay, it's like all spinning plates. It's like, oh, I'm trying to hold on to this. So your trust in the Bible is one thing. The evolutionary and science aspects is another, and multiple different views here, and then experiences like your best friends or the people that you know are not Christian, and some of the worst people you know are Christian, and all factors in to a questioning, is it more likely the relationship with Jesus is something in our mind, particularly when Jesus says different things to people, it seems, and all. So to me, it's an accumulative case. It wasn't suffering as such. Ironically, Bart Ehrman's thing was suffering.
Yeah, it was,
specifically.
That's right.
People think it's textual criticism, whatever, but for me, I would say it was a multitude of things, except this one thing. The thing that cracked me on the Bible was actually to do with the end times. It was to do with Matthew 24 and all about the predictions of. It just made it all fell into place that actually the writers or Jesus was simply wrong. That's when I thought,
when you decided.
That was, as Peter Enns says, what's his thing? It says an moment. I went, oh my gosh, it all makes sense if in fact that's the truth. And that's what cracked my inspiration of the Bible. And from then on, it was a bit like dominoes with the Bible.
Inevitably, in the course of today's show, we're not expecting to deal in any detail with those issues, and we have done them before. And in fact, did an interesting episode with N.T. Wright recently on my other podcast, talking about those sorts of issues. But but that aside, understanding we're not going to go into the long grass of those. It was this cumulative effect, and so that, and I guess that just pushed you to a point where there was no room left in that sense. It got squeezed so far that you could no longer feel like the thing that was supporting your faith at that point, which presumably was some kind of experience or belief, experiences you'd had at least, felt like that kind of got squeezed out.
In a nutshell, just to use one issue, just to show you where that forcing into another position goes to. I was brought up as a young Earth creationist. I then, in my 20s, through various other things, became progressive creationist and then an theistic evolutionary creationist, whatever we want to say. Now, then I found stacks of problems with evolutionary creationism, so much so that you almost longed to be ignorant and be a young Earth, sorry to say that, but young Earth creationist. And I thought, oh my gosh, this was just an example. Where do you go when young Earth creationism and evolutionary creationism have just as many problems? Well, you go to perhaps evolution is absolutely true with the science, but you don't have a theology to integrate because there isn't real. Maybe that's the best way. So that's one example.
And in a sense, what we're doing on the show most weeks is taking one of those issues, for instance, and diving deep into it. And more than often than not, I find this is the big issue for the person, or that's the big issue. But obviously, you were sounds like you were dealing with a whole bunch of big issues, which kind of and you were obviously dealing with a whole bunch of. You talk about quite a few of these things in the book, anyway, Dominic. So you were very aware of the disputes and the issues and the different points of view that people have, and putting them together and so on. What was the point at which, what happened, if anything did happen, that instead of it feeling like the walls were closing in on you when it came to your doubts, you saw the path out of the Indiana Jones Temple of Doom, or whatever it is, whatever metaphor we're using right now. I mean, and is it as simple as just finding the answers to all of those issues, basically?
No, I don't think it's as simple as finding the answer. I wish it was that. I wish I could say there was just a quick bullet point scripted answer to that, or a tangible moment of, aha, now I don't doubt anymore. I think I gradually came to a place, and suffering was part of it. There are other things too, the Bible being a huge part of that, science as well. But coming to a realization, I'm still on the journey, that it's okay not having all the answers to everything. That Christianity, at its most fundamental, if I could use that term, is about Jesus and relationship and intimacy with him, and less about trying to find all the bullet point answers to every single question that we have. And so coming to a point where realizing, wrestling with these things, hashing these things out, finding some answers, other things remain an enigma, other things remain a mystery to me. But in the process of wrestling, in the process of hashing it out, that compression, as you speak of, the four walls coming in, I think compression can also be how beautiful things are made, right? That's what they say about diamonds. It's compressed coal, right? So I think something beautiful can be born in that moment. And I think faith can be reborn in that moment as well.
Yeah. And it's interesting because I've even heard it the other way around. People who were skeptics and atheists, C.S. Lewis almost uses a similar analogy of feeling like the case for God was bearing down on him in a kind of, way in which he could no longer deny it. So I suppose people are going on all kinds of different journeys, and yours was one where it was
with the Indiana Jones analogy. I think that's a very good one. I think that you brought up there. It's like, I suppose, that big ball that's rolling behind him. I think for me it just rolled over me and squashed me. For you either darted off into an alley or fell into a hole. It went over you.
Dominic turned around and smashed that ball to pieces.
You probably say you ducked it almost.
We need to go to this break, so we'll pick this up in a moment's time. We're talking about faith and doubt. Dominic Doan and Andrew White join me here on Unbelievable. Hope you're enjoying today's show, and we'll continue in just a moment's time.
If you listen to Unbelievable with Justin Briley on Premier Christian Radio and enjoy the conversations between Christians and skeptics, then this is the perfect app for you. For the latest updates, podcasts, videos, articles, bonus content and much more, download the Premier Unbelievable app today.
Welcome back to the second part of today's show. There's a lovely quote in the book that we're talking about today, When Faith Fails. It's from the poem Dover Beach by Matthew Arnold. It goes like this: "The sea of faith was once too at the full and round earth's shore, lay like the folds of a bright girdle furled, but now I only hear its melancholy long withdrawing roar, retreating to the breath of the night wind down the vast edges drear and naked shingles of the world." It's an amazing poem, and has been seen by many as a sort of a picture of the retreat of faith in our increasingly secular Western, 20th century, 21st century world. But obviously for many people that's a personal experience, as we've been hearing from Andrew there, Dominic. The question, I suppose, for me is for you, what stopped doubt ultimately being something that was corrosive in that sense and kind of destroyed your faith, and actually has became this thing which is not necessarily anti-faith, is not the enemy of faith necessarily, and part of this, I suppose, I'm wanting you to draw out is an interesting distinction you draw earlier on in the book between doubt and unbelief, and you think the two are kind of somewhat distinct from each other.
Yeah, so I like to see it as a spectrum. So if you have faith on one side, the opposite of faith isn't doubt. It's unbelief.
Okay.
Doubt is that murky middle space in between. It's essentially neutral. It's like a spiritual Switzerland, right? So it's what we do with doubt that matters. I think doubt, like a river, you have two banks, faith and unbelief, and you can swim towards faith or you can swim towards unbelief. But when you actually look in the New Testament, that's what you find. There's different words that are used for doubt and unbelief. Doubt, diakrino, means to be separate or to be torn in the Greek language. It comes from the Latin word dubitare, which means two. So when a person's doubting, they're literally in two separate minds.
Okay.
They're torn between two separate points of view. I was reading Psalm 73 earlier, and the psalmist begins by saying, "Truly God is good." So it's this tremendous affirmation of faith. And yet verse 2 says, "But as for me, my feet almost slipped." And then proceeds to unpack some of the things that we're feeding doubt. And so I think doubt is that. It's when you're torn between seemingly incompatible understandings, desires, beliefs, and yet that place of being torn is actually what's creating the angst and the worry and the fear. I think doubt in many ways can be connected to fear. But it's not the same as unbelief. I would put unbelief is in the category of I've made up my mind. I don't really care too much about what is right. I'm content where I'm at, willfully choosing this point of view. Whereas doubt is saying, no, I'm still searching. I'm still pursuing truth, wherever that may lead.
I mean, in a way, we've got another analogy here of swimming in the river. The bit in the middle is kind of doubt, and the banks are belief or faith or unbelief. But in a way, I suspect for some people like Andrew, they don't feel like they had a choice. It was more that the evidence that they were seeing in front of them drove them, whether it be the evidence of suffering in the world or some issues they have with biblical interpretation or whatever. And I suppose, to what extent do we choose to believe or choose to doubt, and or to what extent are we kind of driven to those shores by the circumstances or the things we see in front of us?
I think at the end of the day, we actually do decide what worldview we're going to adopt.
Okay.
But there are events in life that will propel us in certain directions. I think what I've discovered, and as I continue to wrestle, I don't want to say this is neat and packaged and I don't have any more questions, but what I'm discovering is that doubt can be toxic on one hand if it's just for the sake of doubting, just for the sake of asking the questions without a desire to find the answer. But doubt can also be tremendously life-giving and redemptive. Barbara Brown Taylor, she said that new life starts in the dark, whether it's a seed in the ground, a baby in the womb, or Jesus in the tomb. It starts in the dark. And I saw people who were living this out. One story. I was in Uganda a couple years ago. And our church does a lot of work working with women who have coming out of being sex trafficked or abused. And we've built these safe homes where they can come and find restoration and healing. And then also doing a lot of work in the north, in Gulu, where former child soldiers are now being trained and given opportunities to reacclimate and to heal from the experiences they went through. And when I was up there, I met Sister Rosemary. Sister Rosemary is an incredible woman. She's one of Time Magazine's top 100 people in the world a couple of years ago, nominated for a Nobel Prize, and for good cause, because she has devoted her life to trying to bring hope where there was no hope. She went through that time when Joseph Kony was bringing together his army of child soldiers. She saw horrific things, and these kids went through unbelievable things. Kidnapped at the age of 8 and 7 and 5 in some cases, forced to commit absolutely horrific things, and then trying to come back and adjust to their life. And she saw this, she experienced this. And I asked her this question once, sitting over this incredible meal. And I said, "Do you ever doubt?" And she said, "Well, yeah, of course I doubt." But I asked, "What do you do with those doubts?" And she said, "Look, I don't have all the answers. I don't know why God has allowed certain things to happen." But she says, "As for me, I've devoted my life to bring hope where there is no hope, to bring light in places of darkness." And to me, that conversation has struck with me, because I've realized, like, having all the answers isn't necessarily the answer. It's being okay to live in the tension of an unresolved faith, and being in a place where you can say, I want to devote my life to actually solving some of these issues. So suffering still causes doubts within me. I don't know why. There's brokenness and wounds in the world. But we actually have an opportunity to be the hands and feet of Jesus, to bring redemption and healing in those places.
Andrew, do you want to?
Yeah, no, I was going to say, I would sort of unpack a lot of that quite differently, because, for example, imagine somebody who's... the assumption here could be a bit like you only got the choices of the Christian faith and doubting the Christian faith, and how can we get you to stop doubting the Christian faith? But if there was a Muslim who was seriously doubting, and you had the sort of Muslim apologists and everything else sort of saying, oh, no, don't doubt, they could almost say everything you're saying, but actually to bring them back into the Muslim fold or any other faith. And then, of course, the situation you've just talked about out there, I mean, I'm sure there would be some big names in Doctors Without Borders, which is like the secular form of sort of going out to relieve suffering and pain and stuff, and they don't have a sort of a God to question why he's doing it, why he's ordained it, why he hasn't, why he cries with you. They're just going out to relieve that suffering as like in a sense, a noble human thing to do. So I would say that bringing in the ideas of doubt would seem to be saying, it's almost like affirming Christianity without actually, there's an elephant in the room here, because there's other faiths, there's other beliefs that you can doubt. So you'd have to then establish, you know, imagine if my journey had gone to another faith. I doubted Christianity, but here it's this God and it's this form of practice, and you shouldn't believe in the Trinity, you know, or whatever in some other faith. So I would say that, you know, stories like that would affect me just the same, going out there, and if they were a Christian or not, I wouldn't necessarily think, oh well, that's that's soldier on there, Christian, because it could be someone else who's not a Christian doing the same things, you know.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I mean, I suppose inevitably, Dominic, we all come to these situations with whatever worldview we arrive at it with,
right.
With whatever doubts we might have about that worldview. What's the point for you, though? What was so significant about Sister Rosemary and the way she dealt as a Christian with doubt? Did you feel like she had a different perspective on it that her faith gave her that someone of another faith or no faith did it do something different for the way she responded in what were obviously really difficult circumstances that she was in?
I think the beauty of that one example, and you're right, there's so many different examples that are redemptive of people entering broken, messed up situations and bringing life and healing and pluralism. That's a whole separate topic. But for my personal journey, what I've seen in her and many, many others, and especially as a pastor as well, just seeing people in the trenches and how they've dealt with their doubt and how they're pursuing the way of Jesus. Eugene Peterson, I think, put it best. He said, pain entered into, accepted, and owned can become poetry. So what I argue for in the book is that the pain of doubt, and you've been there, Andrew, it is excruciating. It feels like a spiritual earthquake. It's a very, very difficult time. It's the compression that you speak of. But for me, accepting it, owning it, wrestling with it, pursuing Jesus, bringing the questions to Jesus, I'm beginning to see, there is poetry on the other side of this. There's beauty on the other side of this.
I mean, in that sense, it was interesting to see. I've got a quote here actually from the book, which I quite appreciated. You said, as I grew older and continued to learn about who God was, I was both amazed and mystified by him. Like a relentless twisting vine, doubt and faith grew side by side, merging within me. The two expanded, even flourished together. I began to experience what the Lebanese poet Khalil Gibran once said about doubt, that it is a pain too lonely to know that faith is his twin brother. So reflecting back, I suppose, on that thing that for you, any serious Christian is going to have doubt as part of their faith experience, but that's not necessarily a negative thing.
Exactly.
If we sort of embrace it and don't sort of necessarily treat it as a kind of an enemy of faith as such.
I would even argue too that God created the world in such a way where questions were part of the package.
Okay.
So for many people, they get their theology of doubt from Genesis chapter 3. In fact, those first few years when our family became Christian and we started going to church, doubt was often seen that way, where doubt first entered the world because of the serpent, and because Eve listened to the voice of the serpent, thus we have evil and injustice and sin in the world. And it's true. I think that's a good model of doubt being used in a negative, toxic, destructive way. But if we push back our theology of doubt from Genesis 3 to Genesis 1, then the conversation gets interesting, because there you see a God who is unlimited in and of himself, but then creates a world where limitations are part of it. Just by virtue of the fact God himself made something, he's not duplicating himself, so whatever he makes is going to be in some sense less than him. And we see that. He creates Eden, which means delight, but it had boundaries and barriers. He places Adam and Eve in the garden with their own limitations and boundaries and barriers and things they didn't fully know, and yet at the same time making them deeply, deeply inquisitive and thoughtful and curious. And by creating the world in such a way, I think God wove into our spiritual DNA a longing to pursue truth, a longing to discover, okay, if there's boundaries and barriers, what's on the other side of the boundaries and barriers? And this is why all throughout Scripture, you go to the book of Deuteronomy, the Lord says, when your children ask you this question, then you're to respond to them. It's like God actually instructs his people, I want you to be a question-asking people.
So in a sense, this is almost an apologetic in a sense for someone like Andrew who might ask the question, if God wants us to believe in him, why is he even allowed a world in which doubt exists? You think, well, doubt might be part of the picture of how God is creating us to be who we are to be, because it creates something more, a greater prize in that sense, if we've come through doubt to trust, without the kind of veridical evidence that, simply means we assent to belief. It's something a bit deeper than
and
that,
being
presumably.
okay too with not knowing everything, right? C.S. Lewis, Until We Have Faces, which I think is one of his most masterful books, he said, I now know, Lord, why you don't utter an answer. You yourself are the answer.
What do you make of this, Andrew? Because at one level, everything that Dominic is saying there suggests that there's a reason for doubt. But I know that for you, that the fact that there are so many different sort of manifestations of Christianity and different religions in the world, you feel that that counts against God, if you like, altogether, because you can't see why a God would allow such a world to exist and to kind of be manifest if he's really seeking for people to believe in him.
Yeah, I suppose in that sense, but I'd go one step a bit more than that, because I have read the majority of your book, Dominic, and I did find that actually I think your book would be very, very encouraging for a conservative or fundamentalist who's on the edge of some sorts of doubts. But the assumption that I got from the book, and you've just outlined it there, was even to make your point. You were talking about Adam and Eve and the garden and a certain form of creation, when that is one of the major parts of doubt, particularly if you listen to our podcast when we talk about Adam and Eve and the garden and millions of years of suffering and death and disease before. To suddenly use that as a method or a way to sort of say, oh, well, I have a different view of Genesis from someone else that says that doubt was part of God's creation. But you're already talking in the language, which is one of the massive things. I don't think there was an Adam and Eve and a garden and that was one of the doubting points.
Yeah.
So I don't think to use the story.
I'd say
can
even if you don't believe the story is literally true,
right?
We can still ask ourselves, what does the story mean?
Yeah, okay.
Right.
I can get.
So
that.
I think it depends how you read that.
Yeah, I mean, you could use a scene in Game of Thrones or something and say this illustrates a point. I understand that. yeah, Game of Thrones or Harry Potter, that's fine. But I didn't know. But to me, it's very, very key because a lot of your book did mention Adam and Eve, quite a lot, and a lot of Old Testament stories were given as if you thought they happened. And you didn't actually say, by the way, these are just allegories to help us with our doubts.
Yeah. So, I mean, for me personally, I do believe in the historicity of Scripture. So that's going to bleed through.
That's going to be a big
and writing the book, it was less about, okay, here's 101 answers to all the questions that skeptics ask. Yeah. It was to help those who are in a place of they're not sure what to do with their doubts. And what's a different way of thinking about the concept of doubt.
It's less a kind of, here's my case for God and Christianity to the complete sort of, I don't believe any of this stuff. It's more the person who presumably has faith or has had faith but is wavering and doubting and not sure what to do with the fact that some of their beliefs are being questioned. I mean, what it struck me as the journey you went on and the journey I've kind of heard from lots of people. Now, Andrew is kind of the one is one example of what happens when it goes in one particular direction, but it's not always the direction it goes in, is this idea of deconstruction. And I find I often meet either Christians or ex-Christians who were brought up with a very specific view of Christianity, and where certain doctrines were promoted as being key, and if you doubted those, if those were taken out, then the whole thing collapsed like a pack of cards, and it might be a very specific interpretation of Genesis. It might be a very specific doctrine that has to be there, Then they went on some process where they that was challenged. There were kind of things that came up, and they started to deconstruct some of the beliefs that they had grown up with, and very often what I've found is that for some people, that's a healthy process in the end because they can put it back together again. Right. And for other people, they don't find the way of putting the pieces back together. It just remains deconstructed, and there's not that reconstruction. And I suppose for what you're trying to do is help with the reconstruction bit to some extent. Is the way preemptively. What do you mean by that?
To help those who maybe they're not in a space of doubting yet, but when they do, inevitably, how do we respond? Rather than seeing doubts as an obstacle, to see it as an opportunity for a vibrant faith.
Yeah, and when someone goes through that experience, what I've found, and I don't know if this is your experience, is that the faith they do come out with at the other end might not look exactly like the faith they started with, because inevitably it will change. There'll be differences. It'll have evolved in some way or another. And I suppose that's the problem sometimes I find, is sometimes people are trying to keep a faith looking a certain way when something has to give and there's going to have to be changes. Yeah. And it's just a question of at what point so many changes occur that
even the word question comes from a Latin word to ask. we're on a journey. We're on a process of discovery. And in fact, when Jesus says, "Come and follow me," it implies change. It implies transformation. For me, a hugely helpful thing in Scripture is to see the book of Psalms and how they take us through this process of orientation, disorientation, and new orientation. And some of the Psalms are in that place of orientation where the author is expressing delight in God and belief in God and trust in God. But then you come to other Psalms, Psalm 22, for example, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Or, "How long, O Lord?" These deep, raw, brooding, thoughtful questions, painful questions, without the answers necessarily being given in those Psalms. But then you discover in the same book Psalms of new orientation. This is Walter Brueggemann talks about this, Old Testament scholar. And these are Psalms that have been reborn. These are Psalms that are now reflecting a faith that is coming back together, and it will look different. Maybe our faith gets burnt down because we go through some kind of crisis or challenge, and we begin to put things back together. It looks different. The furniture may be in a different place. The taste of ash still lingers in our mouth. But hopefully that homecoming, even though the home may look slightly different, is for us a faith that is stronger.
Do you feel like the thing's been burnt to the ground and there's no hope of resurrecting it at this point, Andrew? Where's
I would like to sort of like when you hear sort of that kind of encouragement. That's encouraging. I can imagine because you're a pastor that you've got people that would work for someone who would be coming up to you afterwards and say, "Oh no, I was reading this and I'm trying to be positive," and then you can quote a psalm that says, "Look, this guy was in desperation, so use this as a model," and that's all fine. But if I was to put to you to say a form of Christianity, to say that, like for me, I am absolutely persuaded that the historicity of Adam and Eve isn't true, and neither do I think Abraham existed right up to Moses. I probably think it starts getting historical. What would it be like to you if the evidence showed you that was the case? What kind of Christian faith would you then have?
Right.
Because you, like Peter Enns, does not believe in Adam and Eve. He's a Christian, and he doesn't believe in Adam and Eve. He thinks Adam and Eve fit in the flat earth dome kind of description of Genesis. If this historicity, and I'm bringing this up because it relates to how you've spoken in your book, that if you were to do a sequel and start to unpack that, would you then say, well, it's absolutely key. If there's no Moses or there's no Abraham and there's no Exodus as reported.
And I suppose for me, it brings up that other question of what's fundamental, if you like, what's the mere Christianity that kind of has to, what are the blocks that have to be there, and what's the kind of extra features that you can dispense with or disagree on or have different interpretations around. So, as you say, Peter Enns would still classify as a Christian, and my suspicion is, though I'm not massively familiar with his story, that even if he takes a more figurative approach to Adam and Eve or whatever it might be, my suspicion is he still believes there's something unique and special about Jesus and what who he was and so on. So my suspicion is for him, that's the pillar that needs to be in place. The Adam and Eve stuff, different interpretations he can go along with, and not feel that it particularly pulls the rug from under his feet.
Nail to the mast, is that the phrase?
Well, he doesn't have to nail his colours to the mast on that particular issue, sure.
Yeah, and I think
and where do you think those are? What are those issues that you think kind of we do need a certain level of?
A good starting place is Jesus.
Okay.
And then,
clues in the name.
You have the Nicene Creed. Okay. I mean, there are. We don't have time to go into the specific issues. I do in the heart of the book kind of tackle 4 things which I think are pretty significant to our faith. And there are foundational, fundamental things. Look at the Nicene Creed, obviously Jesus. For me personally, though, I'm curious to hear your take on this too, Justin. It seems like the older I get, almost the simpler my faith becomes. Okay. Right? It's like the story of, Jules Verne spoke of it, when in Mysterious Island, you have those prisoners who escape from prison in a hot air balloon, of all things. And they're trying to make it to who knows where, to this little island, and the hot air balloon keeps descending. And they think they're going to crash, and so let's throw some things overboard. And they do, and it gives them just the lift they need to go a little further. Then it starts coming down again, and they have to repeat the same process. And then they reach a point, and they can see the island off in the distance, but there's literally nothing else they can throw overboard. And it says at that point, they cut the basket. They tie themselves onto the rope, and they're able to make it. It's that last dash effort. Yeah. And I think sometimes in our walk of faith, there is a deconstruction, there's an emptying of the basket, there's a reevaluating of things we have on board. I think brilliant 2 examples you brought up, and I've struggled with it too, Andrew, is eschatology being one, and being raised in that fundamentalist home. I was given a certain set of eschatology and left behind, exactly, right. Or you can go back to creation and the earth is 6,000 years old or whatever, and we're told in certain contexts like this is absolutely foundational, this is gospel, and then you go through this process of realizing actually that's not gospel. The gospel is much bigger and broader.
And that's sometimes where I find myself sort of looking quizzically at people who tell me the thing that crushed my faith was this, because I'm like, I never even got taught that, so it never occurred to me as that would be an issue for faith.
If you start to press Adam and Eve with you, though, Justin, and you, Dominic, I think you would start to be on slightly more ruffled feathers.
Oh, absolutely, and I'm not saying there aren't areas
yes,
which you know you have which do. I mean, and I'm happy to put my own 2 pence worth into this conversation, because I would say that there's been plenty of stuff in my journey, and just doing Unbelievable, you know, hear every argument and debate going on under the sun on different things. And I would say I quite long ago came to the point where I knew that the more I learned, that I realised just how little I knew. I will never know everything there is to know. I'll never be able to answer all of the possible questions. But I think mine was a bit like Dominic saying, but what I also learned was how foundational certain things are, and if we can have reasonable confidence in them, and I think inevitably it's got to be something that is experienced as well. You can't live simply by logical arguments and that great argument from N.T. Wright or whatever it might be. It has to be a combination of those things, and for me, that's been enough. I've found actually I can accept that I'm not going to know exactly what that passage means or exactly how I'm supposed to interpret that, and I'm happy to listen to the different interpretations, and maybe I've got an idea, but I do know Jesus has to be God. He has to have risen again, and that has to have changed the world. I mean, that would be the very simplest boiled down version of it. And that kind of is at the center of things for me. So that's and I, like you say, Dominic, I don't find that in a sense is simplifying your faith, because you're saying I'm going to accept as secondary a lot of the other stuff. At the same time, hopefully taking positions on things that I never had to think about at one time, but which now I have had to think, okay, well, if someone was to press me on that issue, this is probably where I'd say the most likely sort of way of looking at it is.
Yeah, I mean, I can understand that, and that's what a lot of people would say. Sort of, in the end, it's like whittling back, isn't it? It's like the discussions about now they're not about even evolution in sort of intellectual groups like Oxford or whatever. It goes back to the origins of life. So it suddenly goes back. Same with this point. Everything goes back to ultimately. It's like you're being pushed back into not a corner, but okay, well, I'll accept Jesus as God and that he rose again, and then everything now is kind of up for potential grabs.
Even there, like, and sorry, I'm kind of taking over from Dominic, but I'll pass it back to you in a minute, Dominic. But at the same time, the journey of Unbelievable has led me to kind of also ask the hard questions of the atheist and the agnostic and everyone else. And I've found, that I just see a whole lot of problems in their view as well. So it's not like I can just cast, even if I did find major issues with Christianity, it's not like I can just, I'll become an atheist then, because actually I've looked at that in some depth, and there's a lot of issues there. I just can't, I think there is really good reasons to believe in God. And one interesting thing is, if I were to kind of run into really significant issues with the Bible and Jesus, I don't think I'd become an agnostic. I really think there's actually just independently good reasons to believe in God, even if you're not a Christian, sort of thing. So I'm interested to know why you would say I'm agnostic now. Yeah, because did it all just kind of
that's interesting.
Go with the Bible?
That is interesting. I mean, remember though, you're a pastor of a big church, and I said this to Greg Boyd when we were talking about this, and you've got a ministry here. I didn't have such a big thing to lose in the sense, because that factors in as well. Okay. If you think that all the people in your church, if you became like me, they'd say, oh, that Dominic, he was a pastor, I was saved through him, and now he's agnostic, he's going to the other side. That factors psychologically in. That's such a big thing. And I can imagine Dawkins is the other way. Imagine if he became a Christian, all of his, everything he's ever done has had to be overturned. So these factors into the way human beings work. But leading back onto the actual question, was it like doubt?
Well, let's come back to the question in a minute,
okay.
because I'm running out of time and I've been blabbering on myself far too much in this part of the show. I must hand it back to you guys.
Yeah.
But we're talking about faith and doubt on Unbelievable. We'll continue this conversation. My guests today are Dominic Doane and Andrew White.
If you listen to Unbelievable with Justin Brierley on Premier Christian Radio and enjoy the conversations between Christians and skeptics, then this is the perfect app for you. For the latest updates, podcasts, videos, articles, bonus content and much more, download the Premier Unbelievable app today.
Okay, into the final part of today's show. We've been talking about faith and doubt. It's a topic that crops up in one form or another quite frequently, but Dominic Doane has written a book on it, When Faith Fails, Finding God in the Shadow of Doubt. Do go and check out the links from today's show where you can find a copy of the book. Dominic is senior pastor of Westside of Jesus Church out in Portland, Oregon. Had a fabulous time out there last year with Unbelievable, the conference, USA. Going to be back actually in the USA later in the year, in California this time. So look out for details about that coming your way before too long. Andrew White is our other guest today as well. He lost his faith. His doubts led him out of Christianity into agnosticism. And we were just at the point really of you explaining why your belief in God went as well as your belief in Jesus and the Bible, Andrew. What kind of led you specifically, would you say, to agnosticism?
Well, I think the agnostic, as briefly mentioned before, really came from the fact that I was originally, I like to call myself, I was a teenage fundamentalist, you know. It sounds like a great book title, doesn't it? That certainty that was there was eroded slowly by just knowledge, mainly within Christian knowledge. Expanded that, then sort of more liberal Christian critical stuff, and then it was like, but it was the idea that I was going somewhere that couldn't be a dogmatist. And it's interesting if anyone likes to pick up on me, any kind of dogmatism, but basically I'm very diplomatic natured, but very seeking for truth, whatever that may be. And that's quite something, to seek for truth wherever it may go. Well, why should it have to be somewhere back within Christianity if it's not, if it ultimately isn't the truth? That's the question we have to decide. And obviously you found it back into the faith and or back into...
But you did level a possible issue, which was, well, you're a pastor of a big church, Dominic, Justin, you run a show on a Christian radio station. You're going to... And I suppose we all have to recognise, I happily recognise I am not a blank slate. I have my biases along with everyone, along with Richard Dawkins in his direction. I'm sure you've got some biases of some kind yourself, Andrew. But I suppose the problem is we have you. What can we do about that? We're going to be doing something. We're going to have some view on the world. The best we can do, I don't know what your view is on this, Dominic, is try to honestly deal with that and do the best we can in not believing this just because our pastor told us or because we've got some job riding on it.
I think it's that moment again of Jacob wrestling with God. So in my story, and I think your point actually, Andrew, is so fair, and it's worth thinking through. When someone has their livelihood dependent on a set of beliefs, then there's a tremendous cost, right? And so for me, I'm so thankful that I had that season up in Oxford, 2010, 2012, where I wasn't tied at that point at being a pastor, and that was my source of income. For me personally, I wanted to say, okay, what do I think about this? Let's reevaluate, let's reassess some of these perspectives.
I mean, was the possibility that you might just jack it all in ever on the table? Or I mean, I suppose
post on our podcast.
Yes, I mean in chapter 4 I talk about how I really thought through the atheistic perspective, and there was a lot of it that I thought, wow, there's good points there. And I
kind of immersed yourself in the literature.
I did. It was part of the degree program that I was in, but I intentionally, they allowed me freedom to create kind of my path forward, this research degree. And I intentionally took that first year and said, I want to study the best of atheistic arguments and then see what happens on the other side. And it was a very difficult, beautiful, life-giving, enriching, redemptive, hard season for me. And like you, Justin, as I began to go down that path of, okay, what do the atheists have to say? And the follow-up question, how would this affect my life? that's what began to subtly and slowly change my mind, right? Nietzsche talked about if you stare into the abyss long enough, the abyss starts to stare into you. And I just began to see where that path for me would lead, where a nihilistic, godless universe would lead, right? Richard Dawkins talked about blind, pitiless indifference, that the universe neither cares or knows, and you're just a speck. And I began to think through what are the implications of life if I actually did not believe in God. And for me, I realized, I would rather live in the tension of an unresolved faith and pursue intimacy and trust over certainty and pursue answers where they're found. And I do believe there's a ton of good answers. Your book, Justin, gives those answers.
Buy them as a package.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, our discussion group did a response book to that, or certain people in there did.
Right.
This is one of the many projects that Andrew has been involved in, a response book to my book, and we've done a show or two on it as well.
Yeah.
But no, I get that. That's the journey that you went on, Dominic, and that kind of brought you through, and you were able to put the pieces together again on the other side. Obviously, Andrew, that journey didn't take place, and my suspicion is that probably you've both read a lot of the same sorts of material and arguments.
Yes, I think your Oxford time is similar to my Spurgeon's time.
But obviously, having looked at broadly the same things, you have come to different conclusions.
Yeah.
You found a way to put it together again. And you didn't find that way, Andrew. And what's the difference? What is it? Just personality? Is it Dominic has some spiritual thing going on that just isn't there for you, Andrew? What do you think might be the issue?
I thought about this quite a lot, and I tend to think, I think not psychology, but neuroscience and the study of that has a lot of voices now in certain books I've read towards belief and the different way people are wired and everything else. I mean, it could touch into the reasons of why is it in my experience females tend to not lose, like all the non-Christian people have taken my journey. 90% have been the men and not the women, not the wives. And
you've even suggested there should be a show on men, the partners, married couples, where one of them has lost their faith and the other continues.
Yeah,
but
I know a whole bunch.
But the majority of those would be the guys who've lost their faith.
And I've got one person in mind who's the other way around, and that's really interesting. And yet he's very, very, very liberal, and she's an agnostic. But the journey of why a lot of the people I know have all gone quite liberal Christian is interesting in itself. I've very few hardline fundamentalists like they originally were, and that's interesting. But I think the wiring aspect is there's something else going on, I think. But why is it? Because I have friends who have known what I know, but they go here, they land in a different place. They don't go off the edges, I think you once said 10 years ago on my podcast, not falling off the edge. I wouldn't interpret me as falling off the edge. It's more like, your book has a bit about the silence of God. Mm-hmm. I tended to think when I read that, I thought maybe the silence of God is a bit like a window of sobriety on the reality that he isn't there. Where then we sink back into the fact that we believe he is. You're just looking at the same evidence, but a different way. And it's like the silence of God. Yeah, God's not there. It feels like God's not there. But what if he wasn't? It would look the same.
Why? I'm curious. Why did you land at agnosticism as opposed to atheism?
Well, partly because of the fundamentalist side. I went to a lot of atheist groups after I sort of lost my faith, and I found myself finding the arrogance and ignorance of them and their fundamentalists. Well, Jesus didn't exist or whatever, something like that, or the Bible is this, that and the other, or all Christians believe the world was 6,000 years old. I hold fire for a second. That isn't true. There's multitudes of views. Come back with that evidence.
So you found another kind of dogmatism that you didn't find helpful.
And so the agnostic, to me, I think that I don't know what the story is out there, and that's what it is. I don't know. I don't even know where morality comes from. If it's objective, there might be something out there in another story yet to be discovered, but I still think it might be in the naturalistic plane rather than Yahweh. Matter of fact, it might even show why Yahweh is not very well behaved in the Old Testament, but this morality, I still have questions about that. I'm not one of these ones who is so sure
do you
about stuff.
Conceive like of, we've been talking about faith and doubt today. Do you think of yourself as having faith in anything, or do you think the word faith has kind of no longer applies to the way you view the world, Andrew?
I have thought about this, and I'm thinking that somebody said, well, what's different about any way you look at something between all, it's like I'm sitting, they put me in, so I'm sitting here and I'm looking down on all these different views.
Yes.
What about your view? And I'd say, well, I would tie my mask because so many weird beliefs in the world. And you just have to go outside this room to different people and they believe weird stuff. And yet other people look at Christians and say it's weird stuff. So I think that the scientific, perhaps, evidenced kind of approach, show me the evidence that's sort of compelling with multiple ways of looking at it, will keep a sanity to the world, because otherwise people do believe crazy stuff. Michael Shermer did it, why people believe weird things. And I think to stop that happening, I found the evidence of biblical criticism plus scientific reading grounded me in perhaps what was really true about stuff. And as much as that takes you away from a relationship with Jesus and that interaction, it's painful because you lose friends, or you get married on that basis, or you this, that and the other. So you do lose something, but just not a whole church.
What's your take on the whole faith
Wow,
thing?
there's a lot there. I think what you said about faith is so important, because I really do think everyone has to live their life in a certain way built on a foundation of faith. For example, you mentioned the morality piece. Aside from, you're deriving your beliefs and what you can gain from science, which that's great, that's beautiful. But morality, that's a big part of life. And that shapes a lot of how we live and the vision that we have and the trajectory and how we love and serve others. So if we're uncertain about where does morality come from, or what does morality look like, or how do we give an explanation for our morality, that does affect life. And that's why, back to that question of why agnosticism over atheism, I'm curious how you live in that tension of, I don't even know where my morals come from.
I mean, one helpful thing, again, that I've found, and I think is highlighted as well in your book, Dominic, is that faith itself has often been thought of as just belief, but actually the way it's defined in Scripture is somewhat different to that. Trust and even loyalty to a kind of a way of thinking, if you like. And for me, that's been helpful, I would say, because faith isn't simply about just something enough imagination to really believe something. It's much more for me about trusting a kind of loyalty to a vision of something, a kind of when I'm not a Christian just because I think there are good arguments and I had a nice experience. There's something about the Christian vision of the picture of Jesus and what this world is that I want to be in, that I want to give my assent to, that I want to be true. And I that for me is sort of a faith. It's sort of saying that's the view, that's the worldview I'm going to live in and sort of claim as mine.
Remember that story, The Country of the Blind, by H.G. Wells, and you have this explorer named Nunez who stumbles across a village, and the village is full of blind people. They had inherited this disease that left them blind generation after generation, so much so that they lost what it even meant to see. He shows up and he describes to them this valley that they're in that was hauntingly beautiful and lush and tropical and vivid and rich, and he's trying to put into words what it was like, and they thought he was mad. They thought he was deluded, right? And I think there's faith in Jesus is something like that, where we've experienced something, we've seen something, and there's a trust element to it, there's an evidence element to it as well. And there will be those, and we've been on our own journey where we wonder, are we all blind? Maybe we all are deluded. But there is something there when you taste and see of Jesus, right? Faith is the substance of things hoped for. It's the evidence of things not seen. So I think faith actually is a response to evidence, not just an emotional.
But like you could portray in a way, Justin, or both of you, that you could say, this is the thing I want to do. If the reality is we want a spinning planet in a galaxy, solar system, Milky Way, and we don't know where the universes came from, and we're just a little tiny speck, and this is happening. Life is what it is, with the suffering, with the diseases and the cancers. This is what it is. To project onto that something that you just want is not necessarily the best
it doesn't.
thing.
No,
It may
something
work.
being beautiful doesn't make it true.
No.
I totally accept that. But my point is more that I feel like it's not that I'm denying that the evidence and everything, we have to take into account who we are in the universe. But the point is that the story I'm living in from the outset gives me a different point of view. When I think of our place in the universe, I don't think we're just this pale blue dot, insignificant in this vast universe. I think, what an amazing universe, and what a privilege for me to be here, because my worldview from the outset is informing what that looks like. And I've often said, the fact is, different people have different worldviews. They are looking at the same thing, but with a different set of glasses
Dale
on.
Carnegie, he said, two men looked down at prison bars. One saw mud, the other saw stars.
I feel like it's been one of those 2 against 1 shows, Andrew, for which I must apologise.
Bring it on.
But you've done a wonderful job anyway. So apologies if it has felt like we've ganged up on you
actually,
in any
it hasn't
way.
at all. It's just it's just that my neck is going to and fro.
Final thoughts as we close out today's show. Andrew, do you want to start us off? And then
okay. Well, I think my final thoughts, not that I've prepared anything here. I got my little note. No.
It's like Jerry Springer's.
Yeah, that's right.
Final
thoughts. I mean, yes, it is. I always find a final thought on a Christian program or a debate when you have to give a final thought. It's always like kind of, if you're in the faith fold, you can actually say something sort of inspiring and everything else, whereas it's sort of the other way. It sounds like dismal.
Oh, I'm not really sure about anything.
You're not really sure about anything. It sounds kind of dismal. But if I mean, it is actually to think that, okay, so if it's all sort of bleak and miserable, but actually it's not necessarily the case. I mean, a lack of belief in Christianity doesn't mean that you're devoid. My experience of people who don't believe in Christianity in my many different workplaces over the years, I was initially bowled away by the sort of implication that everyone's a sinner and you need to come to Jesus and you need to be saved and they're going to heaven and the rest are going to hell in the traditional sense. Suddenly you meet these people that, oh gosh, they seem like they have a heart for care and love for people and they don't believe in Jesus. What? That would have been my initial responses. And it's like, these people, and we all know them, they're amazing. And so the more liberal Christian goes, well, they're all in the fold in some way because they're still in that worldview. I know many people like that who would say I would probably be saved because I've got the right trajectory to seek for truth. It doesn't necessarily speak the words of God, but but that would be, so I would say that, a humanistic, I felt I found my home in a humanistic group of people talking, because we're tribal really, aren't we? And I found that the church was always grating, or a lot of times was these doubts. I don't have that kind of doubts except you sharing doubts, I suppose, with all these people, but you seem, maybe we find people that were wired the same way, and maybe people in the church are wired the same way, and that's the way it will be. Some people jump ship and find another wiring. Right. So that's what happened to me. And so I talk to people and I just think so much makes sense if it's not actually all true. And so many answers to the biblical problems, so many answers to theological problems, to the science problems, to the experiential problems are answered for me in a humanistic outlook that says, yes, okay, it's not objectively true, but maybe people need different worldviews. So I wouldn't see it as bleak as that.
Yeah. Thank you very much for coming on and sharing things. Doubts Aloud is the podcast as well, if people want to hear more. And
Christian Diversity on YouTube.
Christian Diversity, you've made a kind of series, a video series there as well, which I think we debated last time you came on several years ago. So, Dominic, yes, a final thought from you and we'll wrap up.
Yeah, I would just say to any who are in a place of doubting or questioning right now that don't be afraid of your doubts, wrestle with them, and that actually your doubts can lead you to a richer, more authentic form of faith. Frederick Buechner, he said, doubts are ants in the pants of faith. They keep it awake and moving. And I think that as we lean into those, we can actually discover the presence of God, and maybe in ways we haven't before. I think of my wife, Elisa. We've been married almost 19 years. She's put up with me. And there's a lot I know about her. I know she's a morning person. She loves to cook. She loves to paint. She used to be a cat person, but then she turned from the dark side. We got a dog. There's a lot I know, but there's also a lot I don't know. So there will be times she'll surprise me. She'll respond to things in ways I didn't see coming. Maybe I'll hear a story about her past, like, oh, I didn't know that. And I would actually argue that the mystery in that relationship is a healthy thing because it's the pursuit of love. love that leads to the discovery of love. Seek and you will find, Jesus said. And I think mystery is the lifeblood of intimacy. So if you're in a place of doubting, questioning, wondering, uncertain, I would say go after that. Bring those to God. Find community. Find a good church. Read good books like Justin's. Listen to good podcasts. Go all in. Yeah, go. Yeah, and yours. Go all in, and don't just settle for the low hanging fruit.
And what we never got to, but I guess you would both agree on is churches need to be places where people can have that journey.
Absolutely.
And rather than
of all
being
places,
told you're not allowed to question anything.
Of all places. Matthew 28, I was just reading that the other day. Jesus, one of the most pivotal moments in the Christian story, he sends out his disciples, and it says some worshipped and some doubted.
Well, they came to visit him on the mountain,
and
some doubted.
What? Yeah, to me that's, really? He's right there. And if they doubted, that it means it's okay if we doubt too. But here's the redemptive piece. Is that Jesus didn't separate the doubters from the worshipers. I probably would have been like, doubters, get out of here. I'm not going to use you. I'll just use the worshipers.
Not like the goats. Yeah.
But both of them were sent out, and both were vital to the mission that Jesus had set out for them.
I really appreciate the way you both brought your different stories to the table today. Thank you very much. Dominic's book is again When Faith Fails. Links from today's show. And I hope we'll get you both on again at some point in the future. But for the moment, thanks for being with me.
Thank you,
Thank
Justin.
you.
For more conversations between Christians and skeptics, subscribe to the Unbelievable podcast. And for more updates and bonus content, sign up to the Unbelievable newsletter.